Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Soroka, and I am the Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I'm incredibly excited today to welcome you all to the fourth program in our series, The Production of the Self, Conversations about Marisa Merz, which is organized by myself and Dr. Lara Demori, the Marcello Ruma Fellow in Contemporary Italian Art. So Lara, we can wave to everybody. Featuring the perspectives of international scholars and curators as they address the life and legacy of the artist Marisa Merz. This series takes place every Wednesday from noon to 1 from now until October 21st. A special thank you to all of you who have been with us week after week, beginning with curator Connie Butler, who provided an intimate look into the life of Marisa Merz, as well as Laura Conte, who took us into the Mertz kitchen and gave us an insight into the artist's sculptural and film experiments, and the performative aspects that Teresa Kittler expanded on last week. We hope that you will stay with us throughout this journey. Before introducing our esteemed guest speaker today, Luigia Lonardelli, I just want to quickly address some housekeeping notes. You'll notice that everyone is currently muted. During the presentation portion, we're going to keep everyone muted until we enter into the conversational question and answer aspect of our event today, which is going to take place immediately after Luigia's presentation. That said, if you do have questions or comments before that time, we encourage you to share those in the chat box, which is you just click that Zoom chat box and you can add the questions in there. And Laura and I will be monitoring these questions and do our best to make sure that they're addressed during the Q&A. You're also welcome during that portion just to wave your hand and we'll call on you and you can ask the question yourself. I should also note that today's session is being recorded, but the final recording will only include the introduction and presentation sections and not the Q&A. We want you to feel free to ask the questions you have, make the comments that you have, and we want you to feel comfortable doing that. We will be recording the entire series and sharing these back with all of you at the end of the program, with much thanks to the support from our colleagues at the Italian Cultural Institute. And you'll actually, in advance of that, you can actually access the recent programs and their recordings on the Italian Cultural Institute website, which we will link to in the chat function here shortly. So if you want to rewatch today's event or others, other previous events, we welcome you to watch those videos. I should say that this series has been organized in conjunction with the artist room dedicated to Marisa Merz, currently on view at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It recently reopened to the public earlier this month, and I have to say it's really a treat to see visitors back and bringing the galleries to life once again. I worked on that together with our senior curator of contemporary art, Carlos Basualdo, and his support in that room and that installation and this series has been incredible. As a bit of a background on who is Marisa Merz, for those of us who for those of you who might be new to her work, Mertz occupies a very unique and pivotal position in the history of post-war European art. Her work is known for combining a keen attention to materials with a deeply personal symbolism. She's also the sole woman artist associated with arte povera, which is a term coined in 1967 to a group of artists whose work emphasized process and the use of unconventional materials in an attempt to connect art and life. That role of the sole woman artist is one that is problematized and challenged throughout this virtual series, actually. And much of the scholarship and curatorial work that catalyzed what we know as arte povera today is indebted to the work of the late Germano Celant, whose impact on our field and on the history of Italian art will continue to be felt even after his passing earlier this year. As you will see in the installation images that are kind of flipping through on your screen featuring the gallery at the museum, we've included the artist's drawings, sculptures, and installations to give a larger picture of the various materials that Mertz employed. Anything from copper wire to wax to unfired clay to pastel. As these elements, you can see they're knotted, they're woven, they're reused and recombined, often techniques linked to craft and female labor. Mertz insistently subverts these stereotypes of the feminine and the maternal as she then incorporates heavy materials and industrial paints into her work. All of these subjects will be diving deeper into today and in this series. And in particular, this insistence and subversion of stereotypes of the feminine is something that our speaker is going to elaborate on. So I'm excited about that. Without further ado, joining us from Rome, we are fortunate to have with us today Luigia Lonardelli, who will be presenting on Marisa Merz as an Anti-Penelope. I should say that I'm personally really grateful to Luigia for being here, albeit virtually, and for the thoughtful conversations and insights that she offered as we planned for the Mertz installation at the museum. Luigia is the curator at Maxxi in Rome, where she's been working since 2010. She holds a PhD in Italian contemporary art and a postgraduate specialization in art history. In 2016, she co-curated the 16th Roman Quadriennale dell'Arte. In 2015, she was the editor-in-chief of the art section of the Treccania Encyclopedia. And at Maxxi, Luigia has curated exhibitions of Marisa Merz, Algero Boetti, and Maria Lai, among many others. And I have to say that the Maria Lai exhibition in particular was really incredible, as is the catalog that accompanied it. So kudos to Luigia for that. Overall, Luigia's research interests focus on the dynamics of cultural production that feature the post-war era with a specific emphasis on the Italian context in the 1960s and 70s, as well as the history of exhibitions and the relationship between the market and artistic production. As a reminder, following today's presentation, there will be a portion dedicated to Q&A, and we'll try to wrap things up by 1 o'clock. Before I do pass the screen over to our speaker, I do want to extend a heartfelt gratitude to the supporters who made this online program possible. A special thank you to the Consulate General of Italy in Philadelphia, the Italian Cultural Institute of New York, and the Daniel W. Dietrich II Fund for Excellence in Contemporary Art. Now over to you, Luigia.
I would like to open these reflections by recalling one of Marisa Merz's statements, that is, I work from home. I have often thought about this statement during these months in which one of us have had to redefine our daily space and our common everyday and professional actions in places that were previously private. Today I will try to outline a reading of Marisa's work taking into consideration the small aporias, the moments of suspensions, the breaks due to personal choices, and also the objective difficulty for a woman to be able to work, to embark upon, perhaps even just imagine an ongoing career at that time. As you know, Marisa Merz was for a long time secluded from the Italian artistic scene, and only in the 90s was she rewarded with major retrospectives that saw her gain credit in the international system. Previously, the artist had mainly been featured in exhibitions that also included the work of her husband, Mario Mertz. This series of shared exhibitions might almost make her look like an ancillary figure, only apparently relegated to a realm of submissive femininity. However, recent interpretations of the artist's work have seen her associated with a fully feminist sentiment, thereby showing how contradictory the interpretation of Marisa Merz's practice can be. Building upon a suggestion from critic Tommaso Trini, who described Marisa as an anti-Penelope in 1975, I would like to focus today on the ambiguous aspects of her research, in which the representation of the self becomes a way to reaffirm a double identity, wife and mother on the one hand, artist on the other, with both poles finding meaning in each other. The search for commonality and the semantic emptying of materials simply aims at presenting their formal power, thereby recalling the so-called micro-emotional art theorized by Turin-based artist Piero Gilardi in those same years. Much has been written, and the catalog of the exhibition at the Hammer Museum and the Metropolitan has the merit of having well clarified some historical critical pieces about the fact that Marisa Merz was part of a feminist way of thinking, or rather at the beginning of a new awareness in an Italian context, still under construction. Here, I prefer to focus on her tendency to be outside rather than within systems that had been established or were being established between the 60s and the 70s. In the readings and analysis dedicated to Marisa's figures, scholars, including myself with my own personal reading, often we skip reticently and perhaps even embarrassingly the first 30 years of her life, of which we know little and about which the artist was always secretive. There are many hidden sides to Marisa Merz that we cannot yet explore on an historical critical level due to a lack of data. But her identity before she was an artist, and even before she decided to define herself in this way, I think remains one of the most ambiguous aspects of her life. Some have recalled her past as a model, others as a dancer, but in any case, we only have evidence of the fact that Mertz never wanted that past to become in any way significant with respect to her later work. When I say Mertz, a misunderstanding immediately arises with respect to the artist to whom I am referring, because in Italian I could say la Merz, where la is a feminine article that is still considered grammatically correct and in fact renders women's names an object. In any case, Marisa is rarely mentioned in the writings as la Merz, but simply as Marisa Merz. I know that these details might seem irrelevant. Highlights instead how it was not possible for her to be called by her surname only, but always by her husband's, which will attest to an acquired notoriety. Now I'd like to express another reflection of the theme of working from home. At first glance, it clearly recalls Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, but I think that this statement also encapsulates a further stance, namely the desire to remain the hieratic figure, sometimes with archaic connotations, which is then found in the heads dating back to the 80s and more clearly in the not surprisingly asexual figures of the angels. Even the rooms that Marisa set up from the 70s onwards always took on the borders of a room, those of the gallery, her own studio, a cellar. In the words of Anne-Marie Sousseau, and I quote, "The temporality of each piece is reactualized each time according to the combinations in the new space." So working from home, which means not wanting to choose a position in the face of the objective impossibility of being, a condition imposed on women, in particular by Italian society in recent years, constitutes a refusal to propose oneself and therefore to define oneself as a public figure. So the assertion of the possibility of expressing oneself without this bringing with it any relationship with the system. The precariousness of Marisa's setups, both technical and temporal, speaks of a world that does not want to denounce itself through statements, but proceeds by parallel hypotheses. Each time Mertz finds opportunities to portray herself in relation to her works in a different way, integrating new components and new setup variations. The trouble that scholars, even more than curators, experience in approaching her work makes it clear that all of her efforts were focused on the concept of escape. All things that interact with her, and I'm deliberately saying things over artworks, are fragile and temporary. So much that it is basically impossible and even perhaps even pointless to engage in a chronological discourse around her works. everything about her speaks by subtractions, which is why I'm not fully persuaded by readings describing her as a conscious and active part of the feminist thought of those years, which in Italy had not yet reached either maturity or a plurality of vision. However, at the same time, I do not believe that this undermines in any way the consistency and strength of her path, and their poetics has in any case influenced subsequent generations of women precisely because it proposed other possibilities of being and a profound, highly topical reflection on the concept of generativity, with reference to works, but with clear and inevitable references to being a woman and the opportunity of motherhood as a moment of reflection. The materials she used have often been interpreted as a part of this domesticity, but on closer inspection, copper, wax, aluminium, paraffin, and clay are forced to become part of everyday life and a private landscape through long and painstaking processes. While many artists in those years made a transition that brought the private closer to the public, Mertz instead seemed to want to absorb industrial materials often used to produce complex objects within this very domesticity. Moreover, these elements share a feature of ductility that makes them capable of becoming different things and transforming themselves, often failing to maintain the shape they've been given over time, but above all, of adapting to and often camouflaging within the space that hosts them. In many photographs from previous conferences from this series, we have seen many images that testify to this kind of relationship within Mertz's works and space. In the large installations curated directly by her, the materials enter the space silently, apparently meekly, and then begin to multiply, constructing structures through acts of interweaving and overlapping with an impressive generative power until they completely take over the scene. It is impossible not to see in this description also a metaphor of the artist's own attitude. One of the most controversial themes is certainly Marisa's relationship with her life and work partner, Mario. In many photographs, we see her in the same place where Mario was setting up his works on the occasion of exhibition to which he had been invited, while it will seem that Marisa had not only to be included in a list of artists afterwards, plausibly because of careful consideration or reconsideration on the part of the curators. Another reason could be that Marisa would actually arrive at the place where Mario had been invited and only then decide whether and how to work. In addition to the works directly attributed to Marisa, there are also interventions, dare I say it, whereby she adjusted Mario's work, fine-tunings, small calibrations, or more simply set up suggestions. This being together is underlined in many exhibition reports, while Marisa's works, though sometimes featuring interventions by Mario, remain solos. The question of the linearity of these intervention processes is not only, if I may so, every curator's nightmare, but also contains the main theme of Marisa's reflection, the procession of time, cause-effect links, and ultimately, the possibility of being and doing more things at the same time. Mertz claims a time of her own, removed from any productivity rationale, strongly aware of the potential for the development of thought that lies in the emptiness of action. The repetitiveness of gestures and the exploration of all possible variation of a given canon. This is absolutely in line, not so much with feminist thought, but with the political reflection that in those years permeated the art scene of Turin. So the right to be without having to declare oneself through one's own doing that had permeated the 68 generation, which had certainly fed, albeit indirectly on the rudimentary feminist lexicon that was beginning to circulate in the Italian context. In this regard, Turin certainly played a prominent role due to its privileged channel of exchange with the French scene. In this sense, one can understand the phrasing of Mertz verses, which owes much to French poetry, thereby realizing that her cultural milieu fed on the 20th century French literature, and it would be nice if future students could analyze her library. Marisa's connection with some futurist research, which I would say are especially evident in the paintings she produced in the last few years of her career, have been analyzed by Connie Blattler. Here, I will also like to focus attention on the atmosphere surrounding Turin in the 50s, and especially the taste for abstract expressionism that eventually became informal. All of Mario's early works long disappeared from critical readings are in line with this taste. This environment was extremely refined. Turin was one of the most economically successful Italian cities in those years, and the effects of the economic miracle could be seen more clearly there. However, it was also the city where the greatest social conflicts were found and where the first protest movements began to emerge. So Marisa was fully immersed in this context, and I would like to remember also that the couple's house became the point of reference and meeting place for arte povera artists, also because Mario belonged to a previous generation and had become a sort of father of the group. So returning to the theme of futurism, the whole rationale of the research considered as a part of the Arte Povera group was certainly permeated by the idea of conceiving the work as a reconstruction of the universe, as exemplified by Piero Gilardi's Tappeti Natura, but also by the pervasive attitude of Marisa Merz's space in which everything was arranged on stage. So each setup she took care of marked a further stage in the understanding of the individual works and the connection they established among themselves, which were always new and different. In this situation, Marisa's withdrawal became even more evident. As I said, the title of this paper is an expression which critic Tommaso Trini, who was very close to the couple, even in the private sphere, described Marisa in an article dated 1975. For Trini, envisaging Marisa as an anti-Penelope, especially if we contextualize his writing in the mid-70s, meant that Marisa did not claim a certain distance or a need for protection from the male world, but rather established a clear difference. Over time, reading that see Marisa's motherhood as part of her creative process have sedimented. They are certainly rooted in reality, but I also think that the element of motherhood should be read in a more general framework in which she was constantly questioning her identity as well as her awareness of the potential of the artistic gesture as a hermeneutical act towards herself. This almost infinite sewing and stitching work brings us back to the reflection I was just doing on the value of time. Anne-Marie Souzeau described Mertz's time as Bergson-like. So actions are interrupted without the plot stopping. Things are done and undone in order to always remain in the same place, but leave the viewer with the impression that a long way has been traveled. And it is the factor of time that once again binds Marisa to the myth of Penelope. So a feminine archetype, that has become one of the references of the feminist thought, but which on the other hand, according to Trini, is interestingly more of a rather passive figure who builds a defense without proposing other identities. Penelope's daily nocturnal undoing of the canvas is absent in Mertz's work. The copper wire and the sheets are presented each time with new combinations, but without destroying them. Rather, it is a matter of constructing new identities for the work and for herself. As Chelant wrote in the catalogue of the exhibition at the Pompidou in 1994, the artist's first consecration, I quote, "Following the landscape of the self, Marisa produced over subsequent years a profusion of fragments which can only be understood if seen in relation to the very intimate personal scattering." So once again, this scattering reveals not only the artist's personal attitude, but also the work's hiding space by resting on the floor, hanging from the ceiling, or looking for a corner to hide in. On the other hand, the way Marisa never tends to construct, but rather to seek things, brings her close to a poetic phrasing that proceeds through alliteration. It is no coincidence that her very interesting verses always have a rhythm that is derivative both of French poetry and of the brevity of haikus, such as in this 1978 poem, which most definitely has to do with the concept of time. And I quote, "This work existed already before it was made because humankind is ancient." Here we see the return of the motif of the woman who is the bearer of ancient wisdom, which she only has to bring to light. So Marisa doesn't build, does not design, does not conceive, but rather, as she told to Marilla Bandini, and I quote, "I write, I identify, I think, I do not narrate." This non-narrative statement encapsulates a whole way of relating to the world without ever seeking a narrativity, but only the certification of a reality enclosed in things themselves, which, however, does not renounce emotions. In fact, Marisa never chose to move on to the conceptual rigor that the production of men belonging to arte povera was going through in those years. This can be seen clearly in the work Bea, which is a reproduction of the letters that make up her daughter's name, but made by waving nylon thread. The result is an unclear lettering, a name and an identity built with time and effort. The small actions that led to the production of works recall the title of an article by Chelant, published in Domus in 1974, "Small Things, Personal Facts," as well as the hypothesis of a micro-emotional kind of art pursued by Piero Gilard in those same years. By arriving in silence and taking up space if the space was suitable for her, Mertz claimed a sideline position for her research without it being less strong than that of the others. Even the intervention on the Amalfi Beach, in the same place where Susu also performed an intervention, can be read in this sense. Her choice was guided by certain needs to find a liminal place with respect to the rest, to confront the changing line of the water that runs quietly over the sand, to relate with one of her favorite materials, namely water, which is tactile and transparent, but at the same time has a disruptive potential. These objects, later repositioned for the series of photographs taken by Claudia Abate on the Fregene coast in 1970, were transported, laid down, and repositioned by Mario until the right arrangement could be found. So a position that seemed to have been engraved for them in the sand for thousands of years, in a sort of process of returning matter to its land. Resting position is an expression taken from a poem by Marisa, to which the works must be referred. It becomes clear that Marisa's setups always need time and that the artist needs total control over their positions, guided by the need to find a place where they can rest and where the material can best express its tactile and chromatic features. In the desire to rediscover the primordial nature of the materials, there is a predilection for copper wire, an alchemical material whose strength lies in its mutability. Copper was probably the first metal used by men. It has a very high potential for ductility and malleability, and it is an energy conductor. In alchemical symbology, it represents the feminine aspect of the human being. In 1978, Domus published an article by the philosopher, that is Mario, a pseudonym for Mario, commenting on Marisa's work and trying to answer the question, where does the copper come from? The text uses a cryptic at times esoteric tone, suggesting readings without giving clear interpretative keys. The theme of the origin of materials makes a comeback. I quote, "Copper comes from the earth and respects it because it is its inherent product, as does that of the ability of art to redefine millenary materials." I quote again, "Art is in fact the recovery of stone, wood, and gold, and thus art has now brought back to light copper and its wire. Thus the offspring of the earth is given back to light." But in this text, we also find the capacity of matter to be reborn in new forms. I quote, "Art springs from the birth of copper and is reborn to the daily in the shape of copper wire. It is reborn in the offspring of itself, like saying that we could never become wire because we are not primary elements, while copper, which is a primary element, has its wire." And this is where I would like to end the quote, which I realize it's quite obscure, especially without being able to read it directly. But I would like to go back to the main question from which it starts. Where does the copper come from? Marisa Merz does not seem to have any interest in waiving permanent constructions. She's not preparing any canvas to be basted and undone like Penelope. Rather, she seems to want to research the primordial reasons of matter by testing the features that copper, like other materials, has. Therefore, she looks for the musicality of sound in water, for lucidity and odor in paraffin, for the possibility of bending and lightness in aluminum sheet metal. So to conclude, I think hers is a silent and now more precious than ever work of research into small things and personal facts that, once put together, explored and accumulated over the course of a long career, can reconnect us with the Copper Age, a time of transition between the use of stone and metal, exactly the moment when we began to be able to forge matter and not just scratch it. Grazie.